All right, let's get started. And yeah, why don't we take it from the bottom this time, starting with Sachin and going up.
Oh man. Uh, yeah. I was. I guess I was wondering where I read this before, and I guess it was one of those things that uh, uh, Talib used to write a lot about. Um, and can't- yeah, I guess I mean I don't have any concrete distributed systems ideas, but a couple of things I was thinking about was uh, I was reading about how um, there are like sports betting apps, and um, so there are people who are good at predicting um, outcome of sports events, and then there are like people with gambling addiction, and um, there was recently this case of a guy who sort of used his company credit card to the tune of millions to uh, basically place sports bet, and then sued the sports betting company and for basically allowing him to do it. And one interesting thing I learned was that apparently these betting apps don't encourage people who are good at betting and good at predicting the outcome of sports events, because that's bad for the betting apps, and they find ways to encourage people who are gamblers, and most of their revenue comes from people who take big hits, um, and uh, and apparently the people who are good at gambling or who are good at predicting these events uh, spoof activity by like using bots that will place trades between the age of like between the time of like 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. so as to confuse the system that uh, basically that you're a gambler or something. Um, but and I was thinking, so do all platforms essentially encourage only sort of uh, like non-ergodic users, if you can call them that, I guess. Um, and um, yeah, I don't really have many other because like I feel like you could apply the same thing to I don't know, Substack or Farcaster, where like you see certain like decisions being made that sort of don't make sense to you as an like normal like user, but I guess like there's like a small percentage of yeah, it seems like at a certain stage, maybe platforms sort of appeal to a small percentage of um, non-ergodic users. I'm not even sure if I got that right, but maybe I'll have more thoughts later. Um, Nathan.
Sorry, I seem to have lost the unmute button. I can remember when this came out, and I think the Stack Exchange and Reddit mentioned, like this got passed around econ departments quite a bit. Um, I haven't seen much on it since then, though. I'm I'm personally not really surprised. Like things happen slowly. I think some of the critique of it is somewhat misguided. It strikes me that this is much more of a criticism of micro than macro. Macro, you're dealing with large systems. It is more like an ideal gas situation. And a lot of what we think of as econ is really sort of macro stuff. And I think this is much more about like how to think about the micro, a different way of thinking about the micro foundations. I personally have always, I mean, first of all, micro already has like, I'm just not sure it's as solid a branch of economics as macro. And I think one of the problems is that it does sort of tie into this question of like how individuals work. And a lot of this, it feels like the break is really this question of, do you think of individuals as unique entities with unique preferences, or do you think of them as largely interchangeable widgets that respond to their environment and have a history? And I think the have a history bit is kind of important, though the author, it's not in this paper. You need to kind of think of our environment as extending through our history, and that time series, like it's not, the environment isn't a snapshot here. So I tend to be kind of kindly disposed to this. It strikes me as, a lot of the whole question of like, different utility functions and whatnot has always felt very epicyclically to me. And taking it, doing a much more sort of widget-based approach sort of appeals to me in my physics background. But that could also be my own psychological bent there. I'd forgotten that this came out of Santa Fe Institute. I am actually surprised that we haven't done more stuff from Santa Fe Institute. I suspect a lot of their work would be kind of catnip to the people on this call. Certainly, I've always kind of found it a lot of fun. In terms of how this relates to the larger themes here, I'm not sure there's like a real direct relationship. But I do think of like taking it as an admonishment to think of things more at the physical level is maybe the right thing to take away from it. Like there's a desire for us to want to say, this situation is unique, Ethereum is different, Twitter is different, social media is different, rather than, actually thinking of these things as like kind of going down saying, no, we're just going to kind of take these as whether it's like actual, sort of the atoms level or the application level, and be like, no, these are all kind of the same thing, but they have different environments and different histories to them, and thinking about it that way rather than trying to be like, this is a unique, special snowflake. And I do wonder if you could, this is my own thought, if you could also think of entire cultures that way. Is like, are they really different, or are we talking about the same sorts of impulses but under different environments and different histories? And so you can come up with a shorthand, and oftentimes the shorthand is easier. We don't discard Newtonian mechanics because relativity came along, so you would tend to use the shorthand, and you would tend to use in most cases, but it is useful to have a more complete sort of widgetized thing in the background that you can derive from first principles. I mean, that's always what micro has tried to do, and I think has never really succeeded well. So those are sort of my thoughts. I am not an economist. I know economists, but I am not an economist myself. But that's sort of my take on this paper. So that's my piece. I will pass up to Jenna.
Well, part of why I come to these calls is so I can read things that are over my head. So I don't have a lot to contribute. The main thing I will want to, that I've been thinking about, and I'm looking forward to hearing to everybody else, but it's like he took a big swing, and it reminds me a bit of the Internet of Beefs Think of your piece from some time ago. Like, did he intend? Like, did he want to come out swinging just because he's that kind of guy? So that was one of my thoughts. Another one is, and again, this is, I have to ELI 5 it all. Is this really just like a hello, they're a local maxima? So people with not much money or in poor circumstances have tons of different choices and are never gonna, ergodicity doesn't apply to them. They're never gonna reach the heights. Um, I Part of when I read a piece like this that is mostly beyond me, it's kind of fun to think about, well, what are my takeaways? What would I pin if I had an adequate spaced repetition system going on? And so I marked Birkhoff's equation and Jensen's inequality. Both of those sound fun. And then the other thing is just thought I'd comment on his language. I felt like there was some interesting code switching going on. So mostly it's very technical language, the typical academic style. But then all of a sudden he'd get like kind of chatty. Risk seekers and scaredy cats, I noted. And then a couple times he got really personal. Like, well, one of the quotes was, I do not live spread out across the universe, let alone harvest the average psychological consequences of my multiverse clones. Like, he's talking about his own financial planning. And he did that one other time to make economic decisions. I often want to know how fast my personal fortune grows under different scenarios. So that just felt kind of weird, actually, in an otherwise very technical piece. So I will pass it on now to Ben and see what else is coming up.
Yeah. So I actually know about ergodicity from my PhD work. It's a non-equilibrium statistical mechanics. So ergodicity is important in those situations. It's one of those properties that people define it. What the Birkhoff's equation is the equation that people care about because that's the one that's really useful. But the actual sort of underlying mathematics of how ergodicity works is actually a lot more interesting. And it's sort of like you can have the whole idea of like an ergodic system has some sort of like mixing, or like the trajectory is almost like space filling. So if you have some state space, the ergodic trajectory sort of covers the entire thing. And I don't remember if it's, the ergodic trajectory actually passes through every mathematical point, or if it just becomes arbitrarily close. And ergodicity is also one of those things that's really hard to prove mathematically. You can have a system where it looks ergodic, but there's actually these minuscule islands that are not ergodic and don't the ergodic trajectory doesn't enter there. And it took a lot of people a while to even figure this out. And this was like toy systems that were supposed to be useful in looking at like ergodicity. But all that is the mathematical part. It's not actually relevant. Aside from sort of the big factors of the fact that in real life you don't get to sample nearby trajectories, so making these sort of super averages over all possible universes is always fundamentally a bit suspect. Is that something you really want to do? And I also put a link up to Haig's theorem, which is sort of unrelated. It's a theorem that says basically that quantum field theory is mathematically inconsistent, the way everyone uses it. And it's if you read the part on the Wikipedia page about how like conflicting reactions, everyone agrees with that, and no one cares because quantum field theory works. So that there might be some mathematical oddities in it is of only theoretical importance. In practice, you can still calculate what goes on inside the LHC pretty effectively. So the fact that you can run around and scream, this is impossible, what you're doing, it shouldn't possibly work, but the fact that it does work is sort of a pretty powerful argument against that, even if it's sort of not the same kind of argument. So in practice, there are places where effective the effective expectation value is relevant. And you can just choose the one with the highest expectation value if like if the losses and wins are small, and you're going to be doing this over and over again, such that you actually are gonna like look at something that's close to like an actual average. Then yeah, you can just pick the expected value even if it has some wacky, probabilistic, like, maybe it's wider dispersed than you would like, or it might be higher risk. But if it's still small relative to like your portfolio, you can do it over and over again. But so yeah, I mean, I got through about half the paper. I'm not fun, and I did notice that I think Jenna said this. He does move between. He's clearly someone who's experienced with academics, but this is also very much a labor of love, because you can tell he slips out of the academic mode and talks about stuff like Cardano's wonderful and unpublishedly sinful 16th century book on statistics, and other points where he falls back into a sort of more casual tone, which I think is actually fine. I think all the really good papers do that, and that purely being locked into academia is fundamentally destroys any kind of actual connection you want with the reader. But so I didn't get as far as actually trying to understand what his solution to this is. But I suspect that, as you see all the critiques, the actual solution is, well, yeah, everyone knows this, and we just be meta rational and work around it ad hoc, because there's no sort of super overarching theory that's rationalist that can capture this stuff. You just have to be meta rational in your day to day and deal with that. So yeah, I guess that's what I said. I know Taleb has also has also written about this sort of thing a lot. I posted a link up there. But yeah, I guess I'll move it on to Anraj.
Uh, yeah, so like everyone, I also heard about ergodicity from Taleb's rants. Uh, but yeah, I had never had time to actually go through what he was actually saying. So yeah, this paper was actually okay to understand, a bit mathematical, but the link Ben posted about Taleb's article, I think it's a little more digestible. Uh, so mathematically, I didn't understand like what its effects are, but I so initially I started reading like really like how it would be like correct, uh, because it was published in Nature, and then I read through all the reactions of other economists, and people were like, okay, this is like common known knowledge, what's so great about this paper. But I think the paper might have caught on because it's the way as it's written, like Ben and Jenna mentioned. So it's kind of a mix of like normal people can read that article. It's not really dense, but like okay. So I think that is why the paper might have caught on. Uh, and then like it also reminded me like that he blames he I think he's mentioned somewhere that all the problems in the models are blamed on the human behavior and psychology. So I had been reading behavioral economics a few years back, and now I these days many of the replication experiments on those papers don't replicate. So like maybe he is correct on to some extent about this, but yeah, I don't know. Those were some initial thoughts, and then passing on to Anand.
Yeah, I read fast through the paper one time, and then I was trying to slow read um, the specific equations and the subsequent arguments that Ole Peters raises. I think so. I didn't reach to the solution part, like Ben mentioned. I got a gist of the problem he's hinting at, and to me, it seemed like, yeah, that seems reasonable. Like it seems reasonable to point out the issues with the expected utility function, and the sort of time averaging utility function is misses a lot of the details. But I didn't get to the solution part just yet. but in general, I mean, from what I skimmed, I did understand that he wants to eliminate uncertainty in his model, and also to add uncertainty. He eliminates uncertainty in the model and then adds it with a noise, a perturbation that he introduces into his model. But again, like I said, I didn't read. I didn't carefully understand the solution part of it, but that's the high level that I get out of it. But it seems like eliminating all uncertainty, or like uncertainty quantification, is at the heart of this disagreement between like classical economics. And I also found interesting the physicists' relationships that he invoked from like 200, 300 years ago on some of this. So it made me think about how, like, it made me think of this quote that all models are wrong, some are useful. It seems like there is no single right answer to these, and it is a process of like constant iteration and sort of converging to some useful heuristics, so to speak. And yeah, so to that end, I was reminded of the other quote on this on I think Douglas Mackenzie's book, rather, on how economy is like an engine, not a camera. So that seems consistent with this line of thinking. I also found it funny on all of the takedown articles, or like not takedown, rather, or all of the articles that are disagreeing with the premise of this paper, calling out a physicist's approach to economics and how economics is so different, and so on and so forth. Which I thought was interesting in the sense that if attempting to build a formal model for like a very diverse set of behavioral factors that humans seem to exhibit in the first place, it seems like you're not going to get to a right answer. So anyway, I'll stop there. I'll pass it to Venkat.
Okay, yeah, this was difficult because I think, like everybody else on the call, I couldn't quite like drill down to the bedrock of the math itself and form an opinion either way of like, or not opinion, but sound intuitions on how ergodicity and non-ergodicity work. So it's like when you don't have like proper material evidence, you end up interpreting based on like circumstantial evidence and the weight of like the social arguments to some extent. I think that's the state we are all in here. But just to go down to the bedrock level to some extent, I think I first came across ergodicity. I think it was mentioned in passing in some like sophomore physics course, and I was trying to remember what my professor at that time gave as an example of basic non-ergodic system. So a basic ergodic system is just a perfect gas in a chamber with all the atoms bouncing around or molecules bouncing around in random directions. But a basic non-ergodic system, I think he gave an example of something like, imagine like sort of like aligned set of molecules where they all have like just x component of velocity. So they're like bouncing back and forth between two walls of the control of the chamber, but otherwise are not colliding with each other, right? So there's no mixing process. He gave that as an example, and I'll have to think through if that'll actually break the assumption of like time average equals ensemble average. But that gives you a hint of like where non-ergodicity comes from, right? Where assumptions of like interactions that introduce noise and cause mixing in some sense are violated. And later, another example I came across was when I was in grad school for aerospace engineering, and you're doing things like designing satellite orbits. And one of the interesting things you learn is if you want to make something like an Earth observing satellite, one of the things you have to be careful of is to make sure that the orbital period of the satellite is not perfect multiple or divisor of the Earth's orbital period. Because then what, like you can see this in an obvious way, right? If the satellite's period is 24 hours and the Earth's rotation period is also 24 hours, you'll get some kind of like, not necessarily resonance, but it'll go, like it'll either be, for example, geostationary, or it might go up and down a latitude. Similarly, if you have like 12 hours or 6 hours, if you look at the sort of footprint of the satellite's observation capability on Earth, you'll get a kind of like banding effect. So it'll look like, for example, the stripes on a watermelon. There'll be a pattern to the areas of the surface that are covered and a pattern to the areas that are never visited at all. And that's an example of like non-ergodicity. And in this case, it's an artifact of ratios being integers between the two orbital periods. And the way they design around that is to make sure you don't have that. So you would make them non-multiple, and then you'd basically get drift because you don't have like the equivalent of resonance, and so the two get out of sync slowly, and the satellite will eventually cover every spot on Earth. You get kind of similar effects. So the takeaway from like my limited experience with the fundamentals of ergodicity is you kind of want to ensure some sort of mixing. You want to ensure that things are not whole ratios. And I also, of course, encountered the idea in Taleb's work, and his core example, if I remember correctly, has to do with the gambler's ruin and extinction effects, right? So people build their models based on everybody staying indefinitely in the game, but people who lose all their money exit. So if you're only like looking at people who are in the game at any given time, it's actually drifting in a way, right? People who are losing all their money are dropping out, and people with fresh amounts of money are entering the market. So your narrative of the market has a survivorship bias, so it's fundamentally wrong. And I think that's his main example of ergodicity or non-ergodicity. And the specifics of like which person drops out of the market when and how new people enter is kind of what creates the non-ergodicity. But okay, I think those are like some okay intuitions to have. It still doesn't shed light on this debate. So I think, as far as my understanding goes, there's like a few possibilities here. One is that Ole Peters is right, and there's like a fundamental problem in economics, and a lot of it is like a real house of cards, and like there's huge problems, and whatever works is very fragile, and they're like patching over failures with like convenient rationalizations, but it fundamentally doesn't work. That's one explanation. The other is, I think, the defense that the economists are writing, like the note that was posted in response, which is that they know about this, they're aware of this, they take account of it when necessary, they distinguish between static and dynamic cases, blah, blah, blah. It's not a big problem. It's just a modeling approximation that is justified most of the time, something like that. And I think if you look at like the circumstantial evidence, like Anuraj and I think Nathan mentioned the epicycles view. I also think that the problem with arbitrarily modeling utility functions in weird ways is kind of epicyclic, where it's not just the problems of like prospect theory and biases not reproducing. There's a fundamental sort of like circularity to it. It's like anything you don't understand, you model as like individual subjective psychology, and then that sort of like is an epicycle that can explain away anything, right? So you end up with like a million biases, or even if you don't do that and you just have like slow and fast discounting, you're still like making up random theories of psychology that are kind of unfalsifiable. And I think Ole Peters overstates the case. I think there is variety in human psychology, and I think there is like some of it is fundamental, i.e. it doesn't change when you switch domains and encounter a different risk environment. But he overstates the case. There's more variety than he thinks there is. Humans are not all the same sort of interchangeable parts that will react only to circumstances. But on the other hand, I think the economists are kind of covering something up. Like there is less variety than they're admitting, and they're like rationalizing more than they say. And I suspect he's on to something. Like if you did a proper survey of economics papers, I suspect you'd find more examples of like this error and lots of papers. So it's its own kind of reproducibility crisis, right? He's basically making an accusation, and you have to go look at like 1,000 economics paper and ask, are they like making reasonable approximation in a aware way? Are they accidentally and unknowingly making ergodicity assumptions that are not valid and creating flawed results? What's happening? So this is an empirical question, and I don't know if anybody will ever do the study, but that's probably what the situation is. But my suspicion is this Ole Peters sounds like Taleb, a little bit of an asshole, a little bit of full of himself, and acting superior and patronizing. The comic that I posted from SMBC about like physicists trying to fix other domains, I think that gets at it. So he's got an attitude problem similar to Taleb, but I think he's on to something. Like economists, I think, are going to be the next field after social psychology to have like deep problems from reproducibility and like maybe problems like this. So that's kind of my overall assessment. So I would say both are probably overstating the case, but probably Ole Peters has more of a case than it might seem, because you've got so many people defending the economists, but nobody actually doing the obvious thing and saying, hey, forget the guy's arrogant attitude. Let's actually do the empirical study and like survey 1,000 papers and see how common this kind of error is. They aren't doing that. They're reacting defensively and saying we don't do this and our models are fine, right? So it's sort of like just a trust us type of lead defense that you're hearing from the economists. Okay, so that's the specific problem. I did want to mention one thing this reminded me of, which is, you guys remember the famous 2 marshmallow experiment, right? Where they give children like a marshmallow and another marshmallow. Oh, sorry, they give kids one marshmallow and lock them in a room and say, if you can resist eating it in 15 minutes, we'll come back and give you a second marshmallow. But if you can't resist it, you won't get the second marshmallow. That's the famous 2 marshmallow experiment. And the result was that kids who had the restraint and discipline to not eat the marshmallow, they did better in life. Whereas kids who ate the marshmallow immediately, they did much worse. And it was like a huge thing. But more recent research that tried to reproduce that experiment, it showed something very interesting, that the kids who ate the first marshmallow immediately, they tended to come from stressful and deprived, harsh backgrounds. And actually, in their context, it was natural, which is that if you're living in poverty in a slum, you'd better take what you can get immediately, because chances are you may not get so lucky tomorrow, right? And they've done more studies like that. And in general, you can find that children growing up in deprived environments often have a shorter horizon, and it's rational. Like if you tell children from rich and poor backgrounds to imagine a story, just tell a story about themselves. Rich kids will tell a story about their whole life, like I want to be president or whatever, and poor kids will tell a story about one day. So that tells you their time horizons might actually be rational. I don't know how that fits in, but it seems related. Anyway, so sorry, went on for long. It's 1 minute left. Anybody have quick thoughts or last thoughts for a couple more minutes?
I'll just quickly add something. I dropped both of these in the channel, but I also kind of just want to say them. I was actually the reason I mentioned about history being something that we should consider as part of somebody's environment was actually specifically because I was thinking about those reproducibility issues around the marshmallow test that you mentioned. And that we tend to think of environments as like point in time things, but we really need to consider an individual's environment as sort of like a time averaged, or I mean, probably not literally average, but like there's a time component to what our environment is. It's sort of smeared out a bit when thinking about our behaviors. The other thing I did want to say is there's a certain amount of this that kind of reminds me of the whole question about like, is the Copenhagen interpretation the right one for quantum mechanics? There is a alternate way you can look at it, which assumes that things are actually still particles and don't have a wave function, but then uses non-local hidden variables. You can't have local hidden variables, so things you can't observe that are specific to the particle, you can actually show that that's not the case. But then there's a question of like, does the system itself have variables that you can't observe? And you could reproduce quantum phenomenon that way. And that's kind of an interesting question. I think it's kind of interesting in physics that there's been a lot of talk, like some of these papers about like reverse causality are really about non-local hidden variables. They're just non-local in a temporal rather than spatial direction. So I think there may be a lot of this where we might be at a moment where we've built up a lot of like, oh, like there's these very complex systems, and I think we might be at a moment in general with a lot of fields where people are now starting to look at things and say, well, actually, maybe these systems are actually as simple as we thought about them, but there's parts of the system that we either don't know or can't know. And this feels like kind of in a sort of a similar thing is that, you know, oh, well, there's a lot of complication about individuals. Well, actually, maybe it's that actually individuals are simple, but there's aspects of the environment that we don't know or we can't know about them. So anyway, I feel like there might be sort of a general trend in the sciences of sort of revisiting the complexity of systems versus the idea of a limited knowledge, and whether that limited knowledge is fundamentally limited or not. So that was just my only thought. And that actually could apply to CADs because, you know, I think you can think of it as like, well, you know, do we think of these distributed systems, is it right to think of them as these very complex things, or actually are they are they simple things, but we have limited knowledge about the simple things? So just some parting thoughts from me.
Anybody else have a burning thought to share? All right. On that note, see you guys next week.